the mansion that ate its owners. There is an address on Fifth Avenue where wealth became a weapon turned against itself, where a family built a palace to prove they had arrived, and then spent decades being slowly devoured by the proof. The house was not shelter. It was a statement, a stage, a machine that consumed fortunes simply by existing. Staff had to be paid. Taxes had to be met. Rooms had to be heated, redecorated, maintained to standards that allowed no compromise. The family was rich, enormously rich, but their wealth was trapped in holdings that could not be liquidated without admitting weakness. And so they stayed, year after year, performing permanence while the arithmetic turned against them. The facade never cracked. Guests arrived to perfection, polished floors, silent servants, crystal that caught the light just so. But in the back corridors, in the estate manager's ledgers, in the quiet meetings with bankers who spoke in soft voices about terms and collateral, a different story was unfolding. The mansion was no longer protecting the family. It was holding them hostage. And when the external shocks came, the market turns, the tax increases, the shifting city that stopped rewarding old names simply for being old, there was nowhere left to hide. This is the story of how one of New York's great families discovered that owning the right address could be more dangerous than owning nothing at all. How a house built to demonstrate dominance became the instrument of their unmaking. And how the same stone and mortar that once declared, "We are untouchable," ended up proving the opposite. The fall, when it came, was not sudden. It was inevitable. The final decades of the 19th century transformed New York from a city into an arena. Money poured in from railroads, steel, finance, Western expansion. Fortunes made so quickly they outpaced the social structures meant to contain them. The old families, the Knickerbockers who could trace their lines back to Dutch colonial days, found themselves surrounded by men and women whose wealth dwarfed their own but whose names meant nothing. These newcomers possessed everything except the one currency that could not simply be purchased: legitimacy. And so the city became a theater where fortunes fought for recognition, where addresses mattered more than acreage, where a mansion on the right street was worth more than a palace anywhere else. Fifth Avenue was the battlefield. To own a house, there was to make a claim that you belonged not just to wealth, but to power. The avenue ran like a spine through Manhattan's consciousness, dividing those who had arrived from those still climbing. The best blocks, the numbered streets in the 50s and 60s, were where America's industrial royalty built their monuments. Vanderbilt, Aestia, Frick, Carnegie. Each mansion was a declaration, each facade a carefully calculated piece of propaganda designed to say, "We are here, we are permanent, we cannot be ignored." But permanence was expensive. The Gilded Age was named, as Mark Twain knew, for the thin layer of gold covering cheaper material beneath. Fortunes that looked secure were often leveraged, speculative, tied to industries that could collapse with a single bad quarter or a shift in regulation. The same families who appeared in society columns were quietly liquidating assets, borrowing against future earnings, moving money between accounts to create the appearance of liquidity. Reputation was currency, but it was currency that had to be spent to maintain itself. Charity galas, opera subscriptions, the right clubs, the right marriages, the right house on the right street, all of it cost money that moved in one direction, outward. Geography was destiny. To live on Fifth Avenue was to accept certain obligations. Your staff had to be impeccable. Your entertaining had to meet standards set by women who had been doing this for generations. Your house had to look like money required no thought, like luxury was simply the natural state of things. Any visible economizing, any corner cut, any hint that you were counting costs, and the whispers would start. And once the whispers started, they never stopped. The neighborhood was also changing in ways that made old money nervous. The city was modernizing. Infrastructure costs were rising. Property taxes were climbing as the government realized that Fifth Avenue represented not just wealth but concentrated, taxable wealth. Services had to be provided: water, gas, electricity, street maintenance, police, fire protection. The very things that made Fifth Avenue desirable were making it expensive to maintain. And the families who had built there during the early days, when costs were lower and fortunes felt infinite, were discovering that time itself had become an enemy. This was the world where one family learned that a mansion could become a trap, that the house built to prove permanence could become the thing that made permanence impossible. That inevitability was not fate, it was arithmetic. The family rose during the years when American expansion meant opportunity for those willing to move fast and think big. The patriarch, let us call him by function rather than name, as the specifics matter less than the pattern, made his fortune in the kind of industries that built the country: transportation, land speculation, infrastructure. He was not from old money. His origins were modest, provincial, the kind of background that required both intelligence and hunger to escape. He learned early that in America, especially in the America being built west of the Appalachians, pedigree mattered less than timing. The railroads were connecting markets. Cities were doubling in size every decade. Land that had been worthless was suddenly essential. And the men who understood this, who could read maps and balance sheets and see where value would appear before it arrived, could build fortunes in a single generation. He was disciplined. While others spent their early earnings on display, he reinvested. He bought property when others hesitated. He took positions in companies that supplied the railroads, the mines, the construction projects that were remaking the landscape. He understood leverage, not just financial leverage, but social leverage. He married strategically, choosing a woman whose family connections could open doors his money alone could not. He cultivated relationships with bankers, politicians, men who controlled access to capital and contracts. He built an empire not through a single brilliant move but through dozens of careful ones. By the time he was 40, he was wealthy by any measure. By 50, he was rich enough that his fortune appeared on the informal lists that newspapers published of America's great fortunes. His holdings were vast: real estate in 3 cities, interests in railroads and mining operations, shares in banks and insurance companies. On paper, his wealth was enormous. But it was also illiquid. His fortune was trapped in assets that could not be quickly converted to cash without taking losses, without signaling desperation, without admitting that perhaps the empire was not as solid as it appeared. He understood that wealth alone would not secure his family's position. Wealth had to be made visible. It had to be performed. And the performance required a stage that could not be questioned, that could not be dismissed as merely adequate. He needed a house that would declare, with stone and marble and location, that his family had arrived and would remain. He needed an address that would make his name synonymous with power. He chose Fifth Avenue. And in choosing it, he set in motion the machinery of his family's eventual unmaking. The first crack appeared not in the finances but in the expectations. The mansion was completed during what appeared to be the family's peak. The timing seemed perfect. The fortune was at its height. The patriarch was respected in the business community, his name appearing in newspapers alongside the established powers. His wife was beginning to receive invitations from families who, a decade earlier, would not have acknowledged her existence. The house on Fifth Avenue was meant to cement this arrival, to make permanent what still felt provisional. But the moment they moved in, the nature of wealth changed. What had been an asset, capital that could be deployed, invested, moved to where returns were highest, became a liability. The mansion required a staff of 30 to function properly. A household manager to coordinate operations. A head butler who commanded the other servants. Maids for each floor. Laundry staff. Kitchen staff. A chef whose salary alone could have supported a comfortable middle-class family. Groundskeepers for the gardens. A night watchman. A social secretary for the mistress. Each person represented not just a salary but the entire infrastructure of employment. Housing, food, uniforms, the careful management of schedules and hierarchies that kept the household machine running invisibly. The house also required maintenance at a scale the family had not anticipated. The marble floors had to be polished constantly. The wood paneling needed care. The plumbing, cutting edge when installed, required regular attention. The heating system burned coal at a rate that shocked even the accountants. The windows, dozens of them, had to be cleaned weekly. The chandeliers required specialists to clean and maintain. The roof leaked. The foundation settled. The city required inspections, permits, approvals. Each season brought new costs. Summer meant opening the conservatory. Winter meant heating rooms that were used once a month. And then there were the social obligations. A Fifth Avenue mansion was not a private residence. It was a public statement that came with expectations. The family was expected to entertain, not occasionally, but regularly, and at a level that matched their address. Dinners for 20. Musicales. Charity events. The costs compounded. Hiring additional staff, importing flowers and delicacies, providing wine that met the standards of guests who knew wine, creating evenings that would be remembered and discussed and reported in the society columns that determined who mattered. But the revenue side of the ledger was not growing proportionally. The investments that had built the fortune were maturing. The explosive growth of earlier decades was slowing. Competition was intensifying. Regulation was increasing. The easy returns were gone. The patriarch's wealth was still enormous, but it was no longer expanding faster than the costs of maintaining it. And the mansion, the symbol that was supposed to prove permanence, was consuming capital at a rate that arithmetic, not optimism, would eventually reveal as unsustainable. The family made a calculation that seemed reasonable at the time. They would maintain the facade while quietly adjusting behind the scenes. Staff could be reduced slightly. Entertaining could be scaled back. Repairs could be deferred if the damage was not visible from the public rooms. They would preserve the appearance of effortless wealth while cutting costs in ways guests would never notice. But inevitability does not negotiate. And what begins as temporary economizing becomes permanent only through collapse. The mansion was not selling a service or a product in any conventional sense. What it offered was something more valuable and more dangerous. Proof. Proof that the family had arrived. Proof that their wealth was not speculative but solid. Proof that they belonged in a city where belonging determined access to deals, marriages, influence, and the social permissions that turned paper wealth into real power. The house was a credential that could not be faked. You either owned an address on Fifth Avenue or you did not. You either maintained it at the required standard or you failed publicly. This was the product. Not shelter. No one needed a 50-room mansion to survive a New York winter. Not even beauty, though the house was beautiful. What the mansion offered was legitimacy. And legitimacy, once purchased, had to be maintained at a cost that never decreased. The family understood this intuitively, even if they did not articulate it. The mansion was a machine that ran on capital and produced reputation. Every dollar spent on staff, on entertaining, on maintaining perfection was an investment in the family's position. To cut those costs would be to admit that the machine was failing, which would be to admit that the reputation was vulnerable, which would be to admit that the entire structure, the wealth, the access, the power, was less solid than it appeared. And so they paid. They paid the staff, even when revenue dropped. They paid the taxes, even as assessments climbed. They paid for the elaborate entertaining that was expected of a Fifth Avenue family, even when the return on those investments became harder to measure. They paid because to stop paying would be to acknowledge that the game had turned against them. And once you acknowledged that, once you admitted the truth to yourself, there was no way to hide it from the people watching. The Fifth Avenue mansion functioned as both fortress and prison. It protected the family's reputation. As long as they could maintain it, they were untouchable. But it also trapped them inside a performance they could not afford to end. Selling the house would be an admission of failure that would destroy everything the house was meant to protect. Staying meant bleeding capital until there was nothing left to bleed. The choice had already been made when they signed the deed. They simply did not know it yet. Walk through the doors of the Fifth Avenue mansion during its first decade, and you would enter a world designed to make wealth look effortless. The entrance hall was calculated precision disguised as natural elegance. Marble floors, imported from quarries in Italy, polished to a finish so perfect they reflected the chandelier overhead. The walls were panelled in dark wood, mahogany, most likely, though the family would never have been so vulgar as to specify. A curved staircase swept upward, its banister carved by craftsmen who had trained in Paris, its proportions designed to make every ascent feel ceremonial. The lighting was warm but controlled, creating shadows in corners that suggested depth, mystery, rooms beyond rooms. But the real work happened in the spaces guests never saw. The basement was where the machinery of perfection lived. Kitchens large enough to serve a restaurant. Storage rooms for wine, for linens, for the china and crystal required for different occasions. Laundry facilities where staff worked in shifts to ensure that sheets were changed daily, that towels were spotless, that the family's clothing appeared without wrinkles or stains. Servants' quarters, small and functional, where the people who made the mansion possible slept in rooms that bore no resemblance to the luxury they maintained upstairs. The household manager's office was tucked into a corner of this underworld, a small room lined with ledgers. This was where the arithmetic of the mansion lived, where costs were tracked and budgets were set and the gap between income and expenses was recorded in ink that did not lie. The manager, a woman who had run estates in England before accepting the family's offer of employment, understood her job was not merely to manage staff but to maintain an illusion. The family needed to believe the house ran itself. Guests needed to see perfection without effort. And she needed to make that happen while the money available to do so quietly, inexorably, shrank. The public rooms were designed for performance. The drawing room, where guests gathered before dinner, featured walls covered in silk damask, furniture arranged in conversational groupings that looked casual but were precisely positioned, art that signaled taste without ostentation. The formal dining room could seat 24 at a table that required 6 men to move, under chandeliers that threw light across silver and crystal until the room seemed to glow from within. The library held first editions the family rarely read but which demonstrated that they valued learning as much as luxury. Each room was a stage set, maintained not for daily living but for the moments when the right people would see it and draw the right conclusions. The family's private quarters occupied the second floor. The master bedroom suite, bedroom, dressing rooms, private sitting room, bathrooms with fixtures that represented the latest in modern plumbing, was designed for comfort but also for display. Even in private spaces, the family performed for each other, maintaining the fiction that the mansion was not a burden but a blessing, that the costs were insignificant, that everything was exactly as it should be. The third floor held the children's rooms and guest suites, spaces that were used less frequently but had to be maintained with the same attention as the public areas. A guest could not be shown to a room that was less than perfect. A child could not grow up in surroundings that suggested economizing. Every floor, every room, every corner had to meet the standard, or the entire illusion would crack. And throughout the house, in ways guests would never notice, the evidence of strain was beginning to appear. Repairs deferred. Fabrics that should have been replaced but were instead cleaned one more time. Staff positions that went unfilled when someone left. Small economies that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested a household under pressure. The mansion looked the same from the outside. But the machine inside was beginning to falter. The household operated according to rules that were never written but brutally enforced. Staff were hired not just for competence but for discretion. The butler understood that his primary job was not to serve meals but to control information. What happened inside the house stayed inside the house. Guests' behavior, family arguments, the letters that arrived marked urgent, the meetings with bankers that happened in the study with doors closed, all of it was to be observed, managed, and forgotten. The servants who lasted were the ones who understood that their loyalty was purchased with their salary, and that loyalty meant silence. The morning routine began before the family woke. Fires were lit in rooms that would be used. Breakfast was prepared to standards that allowed no variation. The toast at a precise temperature, the eggs exactly as each family member preferred, the coffee strong but not bitter, the cream cold but not iced. The morning papers were ironed to remove wrinkles and laid out in the order the patriarch preferred. The front entrance was swept and polished. By the time the family descended the stairs, the evidence of work had been erased, leaving only the result, a house that appeared to run itself. The rules extended to visitors. Callers were assessed at the door by a servant trained to distinguish between those who should be immediately admitted, those who should be made to wait, and those who should be politely turned away. The family's social secretary maintained lists, who had been entertained recently, who owed a return invitation, who mattered and who only thought they did. Invitations were strategic weapons, extended not because the family liked someone but because their presence served a purpose. Business connections, social positioning, the maintenance of relationships that translated into access. Money moved through the house in ways that were invisible to guests but obvious to staff. Suppliers delivered goods and submitted invoices that were reviewed in the estate manager's office. Some were paid promptly. Others were delayed, with apologies and assurances. The delay was strategic, stretching payment terms without quite breaking relationships, preserving cash flow for expenses that could not be deferred. The household manager kept 2 sets of books, one that showed what was owed, and one that showed what could actually be paid. Contemporary accounts from former staff, recorded years later when the house was gone and confidentiality no longer mattered, describe a household that looked perfect but felt increasingly tense. The patriarch grew irritable about costs that had never bothered him before. The matriarch became obsessed with comparisons, what other families spent on entertaining, whether their flowers were as impressive, whether anyone had noticed that the curtains had not been replaced this season. The children, raised in the house, absorbed the anxiety without understanding its source, learning to treat wealth as something fragile rather than secure. Behind the facade, small betrayals multiplied. A senior servant borrowed money from a merchant and was quietly dismissed. A secretary was caught sharing information with a journalist and disappeared without explanation. The family trusted no one completely, because complete trust required admitting the truth, that the mansion was no longer a symbol of strength but of vulnerability, and that anyone who understood this could weaponize it. The machine still worked. Guests still arrived to perfection. But the cost of perfection was compounding, and the resources available to maintain it were shrinking. And everyone inside the house, family and staff alike, understood what no one would say aloud. Inevitability was not a threat. It was already happening. The peak came during a winter season when everything looked perfect and nothing was. The family hosted one of the great social events of the season, an event that would be remembered and discussed and used as a reference point for years. A formal dinner followed by a private concert, guest list limited to 60, every detail calibrated to demonstrate that the family's position was not just secure but unassailable. The invitations went out on heavy stock with engravings so fine you could feel the letters with a fingertip. The acceptances came quickly. An invitation to this house, on this night, was currency in itself. Preparation consumed the household for 2 weeks. Additional staff were hired temporarily to supplement the permanent household. The silver was polished until it reflected like mirrors. The crystal was inspected piece by piece, any item with the slightest imperfection replaced. The chef worked with the matriarch to design a menu that would be innovative without being strange, luxurious without being ostentatious. Oysters to start, followed by consommé, then fish, then a palate cleanser, then the main courses, duck, beef, lamb, all prepared with sauces that required ingredients ordered from importers who dealt only with the city's best households. The wine was selected with the same care, bottles from vintages that would be recognized and appreciated by guests who knew wine. The conservatory was transformed into a concert hall. Chairs were arranged in careful rows. A small stage was constructed for the musicians. A string quartet from Vienna, secured at considerable expense and promoted as exclusive, a performance that would not be repeated elsewhere in the city. Heating was adjusted to ensure the room would be comfortable but not warm enough to make guests drowsy. Lighting was tested and retested until the effect was perfect, bright enough to see, soft enough to flatter. The night arrived cold and clear, the kind of winter evening that made Fifth Avenue look like a stage set. Carriages began arriving just after 8, depositing guests at the entrance where the butler and 2 footmen stood ready to receive them. Each arrival was a small social calculation. Who came with whom, who arrived alone, who was dressed in new fashions and who wore last season's gowns with jewelry that compensated. The guests moved through the entrance hall into the drawing room, where champagne was served and small talk circulated like currency. The dinner began precisely at 9. The guests moved to the dining room and found their places according to a seating chart the matriarch had revised a dozen times, balancing personalities and relationships and the unspoken rules about who could be placed next to whom. The meal proceeded in courses that came at intervals designed to allow conversation without rushing. The service was invisible. Plates appeared and disappeared without guests noticing the staff who made it happen. The wine flowed but was never poured too generously. The patriarch presided from the head of the table with the ease of a man who had done this hundreds of times, who knew how to guide conversation, when to tell a story, when to defer to a guest whose ego required attention. But beneath the performance, costs were accumulating in ways the guests could not see. The flowers alone cost what a working family might earn in 3 months. The additional staff represented wages that would strain the quarterly budget. The wine being poured was from reserves that could not easily be replaced. The food waste, inevitable when serving courses that not every guest would finish, represented capital simply discarded. Each moment of perfection had a price tag, and that price was being added to a total that was growing faster than the family's revenue. After dinner, the guests moved to the conservatory for the concert. The quartet performed pieces by Mozart and Brahms, music that was familiar enough to be appreciated but complex enough to demonstrate sophistication. The audience listened with the attention required of them, applauding at the appropriate moments. When it ended, guests lingered, discussing the performance, complimenting the hosts, extending and receiving invitations that would require reciprocation. It was nearly 1 in the morning before the last carriage departed. The patriarch and matriarch stood in the entrance hall after the door closed behind the final guest, surrounded by staff already beginning the work of cleaning up, restoring the house to its normal perfection. The evening had been a triumph by every measure that mattered: attendance, conversation, the performance itself, the compliments that would circulate through society in the days to come. The family's position had been reinforced. Their place in the city's hierarchy had been confirmed. But in the estate manager's office, where the costs were being tallied, a different story was being written. The evening had cost more than anticipated. And the timing was unfortunate. The expenses came during a quarter when other investments were underperforming, when taxes were due, when creditors were asking questions about payment schedules that had been quietly extended. The triumph was real. But so was the arithmetic. The peak had been reached. And peaks, by definition, mark the moment before the descent begins. The enemy did not announce itself with dramatic speeches or moral crusades. It arrived as arithmetic, as time, as the inevitable forces that turn confidence into liability. The family discovered that they were fighting not villains but numbers. Property taxes that climbed every year as the city reassessed Fifth Avenue addresses, understanding that concentrated wealth could bear concentrated taxation. Operating costs that increased as wages rose and as suppliers learned they could charge premium prices to families who could not afford to shop for bargains. Maintenance expenses that compounded as the house aged, as systems installed at the mansion's peak required replacement, as delayed repairs created larger problems that could no longer be ignored. The patriarch was aging. His energy for managing the empire, for tracking investments, for making decisions about when to sell and when to hold, for maintaining the relationships that kept capital flowing, was diminishing. He had built the fortune through constant attention, through being the person who saw opportunities before others did. But he was tired. And the world was changing faster than he could adapt. New industries were emerging. Old industries were consolidating. Regulations were being imposed. The rules that had made fortunes possible were being rewritten by reformers who believed concentrated wealth was dangerous to democracy. The city itself was turning against old money in subtle ways. Progressive politicians were winning elections on platforms that promised to tax the wealthy more heavily, to provide services for working families, to redistribute resources that had flowed disproportionately to neighborhoods like Fifth Avenue. Property taxes were not confiscatory, not yet, but they were rising at rates that made projections frightening. The mansion that had seemed like an asset was increasingly being treated by the city as a taxable resource, something that could be leveraged to fund schools and services and infrastructure improvements for the broader population. And then there were the whispers. Society operates on information that moves faster than news. Suppliers talk to each other. Staff change households and carry stories. Bankers notice when payment patterns shift. Lawyers hear things in confidence that they share carefully with other lawyers. The family's small economies, the staff positions left unfilled, the entertaining that happened less frequently, the repairs that were deferred, were noticed. And once noticed, they were discussed. And once discussed, they became facts, whether or not they were accurate. The matriarch understood this better than anyone. She had built her position through decades of careful social management, through understanding that reputation was fragile and had to be defended every day. She pushed back against the economies the patriarch wanted to implement. They could not reduce entertaining. To do so would signal weakness. They could not cut visible staff. Guests would notice. They could not allow any hint of shabbiness. Perception was reality in their world. But she also understood the mathematics. They were trapped between maintaining appearances and maintaining solvency. And there was no clear path that preserved both. Internal tensions grew. The patriarch wanted to sell some properties to improve cash flow, but the matriarch argued this would signal distress. The children, now adults, pressed for inheritances or allowances that reflected the family's supposed wealth, not understanding that wealth tied up in assets was different from wealth available to spend. The household manager presented budgets that could not be reconciled with available funds without making cuts that would be visible. Every meeting, every discussion, every decision became an argument about which kind of failure was least catastrophic. The household staff sensed the strain and began making private preparations. Senior servants started looking for new positions, understanding that a sinking household was not a place to build a career. Suppliers became less flexible about payment terms. The family's lawyer began having quiet conversations about options, restructuring debt, selling assets, possibly even selling the mansion itself, though he couched this last suggestion in hypotheticals, knowing the family was not ready to hear it directly. Then came the external shock. The details matter less than the pattern. A financial panic that tightened credit across the city, or a market downturn that devastated specific industries the family had invested in, or a legal change that made previously profitable arrangements suddenly unprofitable. What mattered was that an external force converted a private strain into an unavoidable crisis. The family's creditors, who had been patient when times were good, became insistent when times were bad. Lines of credit were reduced. Loans that had been quietly rolled over came due. And the paper wealth the family had always relied on, the value of their holdings, their social capital, their reputation, proved insufficient when measured against obligations that demanded cash. The fortress had become a cage. And the cage was closing. The collapse did not happen in a single moment but across months that felt like slow drowning. The first liquidation was private. The patriarch sold properties he had held for decades, taking losses because he needed immediate cash rather than optimal prices. The transactions were structured to be discreet, private sales, no public auctions, buyers selected for their discretion as much as their capital. The family told themselves this was strategic repositioning, not distress. But the numbers told a different story. The cash raised covered immediate obligations but did nothing to address the fundamental problem. The mansion consumed more capital than the remaining empire generated. Staff were informed that the household would be reduced. Positions would be eliminated. The dismissals were framed as natural transitions, retirements, personal decisions to pursue other opportunities, but everyone understood what was happening. Senior servants who had worked for the family for years found themselves unemployed, their severance packages smaller than they had expected, their loyalty rewarded with polite letters of recommendation and not much else. The remaining staff absorbed additional duties, maintaining the appearance of a full household while functioning with half the people. Entertaining stopped. The family framed this as a temporary withdrawal, health concerns, business pressures, a desire for privacy, but society understood. When a Fifth Avenue family stops hosting, it means only one thing. The invitations that used to arrive regularly began to decline. Other families, sensitive to the possibility of association with failure, created distance. The matriarch, who had spent decades building relationships, watched them evaporate with a speed that was both remarkable and predictable. Then came the moment that made the crisis public. The mansion was listed for sale. The listing was handled as discreetly as possible, but discretion was impossible for a property like this. The real estate community was small and interconnected. Within days, everyone who mattered knew that one of Fifth Avenue's great houses was on the market. The asking price was ambitious. The family needed a number that would resolve their obligations and leave them something to rebuild with. But potential buyers understood they were negotiating with a family that had no choice but to sell, which meant the asking price was a starting point for downward pressure. The family remained in the house during this period, which made the situation even more painful. They lived among possessions being appraised, in rooms being shown to strangers who walked through with the critical eye of people assessing a purchase. The matriarch maintained her dignity, greeting potential buyers with the courtesy of a hostess, even as they discussed tearing down walls, subdividing rooms, converting her home into something unrecognizable. The patriarch spent most days in his study, reviewing documents that detailed the fragmentation of the empire he had built. The auction of contents came next. What could not be sold with the house would be sold separately. The furniture, the art, the silver, the crystal, the carpets, the chandeliers, everything was catalogued and sent to auction houses. Buyers came from across the country, collectors who wanted pieces from a Fifth Avenue mansion without the burden of maintaining one. The carved banister from the main staircase. The chandelier from the entrance hall. The first editions from the library. Each item sold separately, scattered to locations where it would be valued for beauty rather than context. The final sale of the mansion came at a price substantially below the asking. The buyer, a developer who planned to convert it into luxury apartments, saw opportunity where the family had seen legacy. The transaction was structured to close quickly, which meant accepting terms the family would have rejected in better circumstances. The proceeds covered the outstanding debts and little else. The empire that had once been vast was reduced to liquid capital that could be measured in bank balances that seemed modest after decades of living at a Fifth Avenue scale. The family moved out on a winter morning, their possessions reduced to what could fit in a few trunks, their departure observed by neighbors who watched from windows but did not come out to say goodbye. The staff had already been dismissed, except for a single servant who stayed to coordinate the final details. When the door closed behind them for the last time, the house stood empty, waiting for the renovations that would erase the family's presence and transform their tragedy into someone else's opportunity. Today, the address still exists, but the mansion as the family knew it does not. The building was subdivided, converted into residential units that rent at premium prices, marketed to professionals who want a Fifth Avenue address without the burden of maintaining it themselves. The entrance hall where guests once arrived to perfection is now a lobby. The drawing room where society gathered is now 3 separate apartments. The dining room where the peak night unfolded is now office space. The conservatory where the string quartet performed was demolished to create a modern amenity area. The family name survived in some corners, charitable foundations that carry their name, business entities that outlasted the mansion, descendants who rebuilt modest fortunes and learned from their ancestors' mistakes. But the dynasty that had seemed permanent, the legacy that had seemed secure, proved to be as vulnerable as any other to the forces of arithmetic and time. What stands at the address now has no memory of what it was. The current residents know, if they know anything, only that the building has history. But history without specifics is just atmosphere, a vague sense of old money and old mistakes that makes no demands on the present. The mansion ate its owners. And when nothing was left to consume, it moved on to the next generation of people willing to pay for the privilege of living where someone else had failed. Stand outside the address today and you will see a building that has outlived its meaning. The facade has been preserved. Landmark regulations ensure that certain architectural elements cannot be altered. But preservation is not the same as remembering. The stone that once declared permanence now declares only continuity, which is a different thing entirely. The building endures because buildings do, not because anyone inside remembers the family that built it or understands the machinery of their unmaking. Walk through the lobby where the entrance hall used to be, and you will find a space designed for efficiency rather than impression. The marble floors remain, but they lead to elevators, not to rooms designed for performance. The doorman is there to provide security and accept packages, not to assess social credentials. The building functions now as real estate, valued for location and amenities, not for the stories it once housed or the reputations it once protected. The transformation is complete. What was once a private fortress is now a commodified address. The same walls that once guarded a family's secrets now contain dozens of households that have no connection to each other beyond shared ownership of square footage. The same rooms that once staged elaborate performances now hold furniture from catalogues and art bought for its color coordination. The mansion has been democratized, which is to say it has been emptied of meaning and refilled with a meaning that can be purchased by anyone with sufficient capital. This is not a tragedy in any dramatic sense. No one died. No crime was committed. The family's decline hurt them, certainly, and hurt the staff who depended on their employment, but it did not destroy anything except the illusion that wealth and status were the same as permanence, which is perhaps the only lesson worth taking from the entire story. But there are questions worth sitting with. When does a home stop being shelter and become a machine that eats its owners? At what point does the cost of proving wealth exceed the value of the wealth itself? Is a fortune real if it cannot be liquid, if it exists only on paper, if spending it means admitting it was never what it appeared to be? And how many American dynasties fell not to enemies or scandals but simply to the arithmetic of maintenance, to the inevitability of costs that compound while revenue stagnates, to the impossible burden of maintaining perfection in a world that changes faster than traditions can adapt? The Fifth Avenue mansion proved that stone and mortar cannot create permanence, only the appearance of it. That social position purchased through display requires constant spending to maintain. That a house built to demonstrate dominance can become the instrument of submission. That inevitability is not dramatic. It is quiet, mathematical, patient. The family learned what every family that builds too large eventually learns, that the mansion does not serve you. You serve it. And when you can no longer perform that service, the mansion does not vanish. It simply finds new owners, new purposes, new stories that erase yours. The building stands. The family is gone. And the only thing that survived intact was the address.